If you would open your Bibles to 2 Corinthians chapter 12, that's where we are tonight. We've been studying through the book of 2 Corinthians. We are nearing the end after we had already studied through the book of 1 Corinthians, and I'm sure it isn't as connected for you as it is for me because I spend time during the week, probably more time than you do in these passages, preparing the lesson. At least I hope I do. But I hope there is some continuity, some flow that you have seen as we've studied through these two books. Maybe you have come to a better understanding, or you've been reminded of a better understanding of Paul's nature or Paul's relationship with the Corinthian church. I certainly have, as I've studied through these books all at one time. I hope that it's been a benefit for you. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, last week, the beginning of chapter 12, last week, we talked about Paul's thorn in the flesh. Paul has some ailment or some physical pain that he has been given by God or from God as a result or a consequence of those revelations that Paul experienced, the visions that he saw. He was taken up to that third heaven, to paradise, where God is, in the presence of God. And he saw things that he couldn't repeat, that he couldn't speak. He heard things that he could not repeat. And because of that, because of the glory that Paul had witnessed, he was given this thorn in the flesh to keep him from exalting himself and to keep him humble. And you remember in this passage of Scripture that he's defending himself, defending his apostleship, defending his trustworthiness to these Corinthian Christians. And in doing that, what he does is he boasts just a little bit. And he apologizes the entire time. He feels like he's been forced to brag, we might say, just a little bit, to stoop down to that level in order to defend himself, in order to explain that he is in fact a true apostle. And that the words that he speaks are the words that this congregation should listen to. We talked about the physical trials in chapter 11, I think it is, that Paul has experienced in his life, the persecutions that he has experienced, and yet with this thorn in the flesh that we talked about last week, it is seemingly so severe that Paul specifically prays to God. The Bible says 3 times that it would be removed, and yet God said, "No, my grace is sufficient for you." And now as we come to the second half and the end of chapter 12, I want us to picture a courtroom drama. Maybe some of you look like Perry Mason fans going way back, or maybe it was, I think his name was Ben Matlock in the 80s and 90s. Maybe one of the newer courtroom dramas that we have on TV, and near the end of all of those, there are the closing arguments, where the lawyer for the defense and the lawyer for the prosecution might stand up and turn to that jury and give this impassioned plea on why this person is guilty. Or they'll turn to that jury, if they're the defense, and they'll bring in as much authority and emotion as they can, maybe be as concise as they can with that jury. They'll lead them down this path and really try to make sure that they understand that my client is innocent. And maybe that's kind of where we are with Paul as he closes out his defense here. He's like that defense attorney who stands up at the end of that television show and makes this powerful closing argument. And as I present it to you tonight, as we study it together, it will certainly not be as powerful as it would have been if you were a member at Corinth and you had read these 2 letters, if you knew Paul. Maybe Paul converted you. Maybe he converted your entire family. Maybe you saw the miraculous abilities that Paul had as an apostle. Maybe he laid his hands on you and gave you some miraculous abilities as well. You've heard people talk about him and say negative things about him. Now you've read these letters written by Paul himself. You're looking forward to him coming, and this is how he begins to close these letters. First thing he says is, I am not inferior. Paul says, I am not inferior to any other apostle. In chapter 12 and verse 11, Paul says, I have become foolish. And he's talking about bragging. He's engaged in this foolishness of sort of bragging on himself. He's being a little facetious. He says, I have become foolish. You yourselves compelled me. Actually, I should have been commended by you, for in no respect was I inferior to the most eminent apostles, even though I am a nobody. Paul ends that statement, is where I want to begin. He says, even though I am a nobody, even though I am humble, even though I don't think highly of myself, and I think he's talking about his past, even though I have this terrible past as a man who has persecuted the church, even though my past would say that I don't deserve the great honor that God has granted me, that is exactly how Paul felt about himself. In Acts chapter 26, he says, I punished them often in the synagogues. I tried to force them to blaspheme. He said, being furiously enraged with them, I kept pursuing them even to foreign cities. He's talking about how he treated the church before he came to know Christ. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 9, and you don't need to turn there, he said, for I am the least of the apostles, and not fit to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. Paul says, I know what I've done. I know that I persecuted the church. And because I have persecuted the church, I am at least of all deserving of this office of apostleship. Because of his persecution of the Lord, and because of his persecution of the Lord's church, Paul says, I am a nobody. I don't deserve this. I'm not acting as though I do. I'm not claiming that I do, but I am not inferior to any other apostle. And again, that was the accusation clearly being made of Paul. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 10, the next verse, he says, but by the grace of God, I am what I am. And his grace toward me did not prove vain, but I labored even more than all of them, yet not I, but the grace of God with me. Paul says, I don't deserve this, but by the grace of God, this is what I am. He says, I am inferior to those other apostles, maybe in the way that I lived my life previously, maybe because I've got this guilt that I carry with me that I wrestle with, but when it comes to my authority, when it comes to the apostolic authority, Paul says that he is inferior to no one. Paul was called by Christ, just like Peter and Andrew and James and John and all the other apostles. Paul was sent by Christ, just like Peter and Andrew and James and John. Paul was given the gospel message directly from Christ himself, just like all of those other apostles. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, it's the same themes that we see throughout these two books. He says, am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? I was there. I saw him on the road to Damascus. Christ is the one who called me, just like he called those others. Christ is the one who gave me this message, just like he gave it to those others. I have the same authority as all of those other apostles do. What's curious in 2 Corinthians here is his use of that phrase, the most eminent apostles. Did you notice that phrase? Does that stand out to you? It's a phrase that Paul uses. He also uses it in chapter 11 and verse 5. He talks therefore I consider myself not in the least inferior to the most eminent apostles. And I think usually when we come to that passage or we hear him say that, we think, what in the world does Paul mean? Why is he speaking like that? And we would typically say, what I've typically heard, is that he doesn't really mean that. It is, again, Paul being a little facetious. He is, again, throwing in a little sarcasm here, just like we see throughout the chapter. But that may be it, but I kind of don't think that's it. I've never quite been comfortable just thinking that Paul's throwing around names about the other apostles in that casual manner. I think that if Paul spoke of the other apostles in that way, very sarcastically, well, I'm not one of the most eminent apostles. I think if Paul spoke that way about real men, chosen by Christ, sent out to share the gospel, given those miraculous gifts, I think that would be a little disrespectful. And maybe I'm missing something in the translation. I could be wrong. I'm fine with that. This is my opinion, and it's worth about that much. But it seems to me that maybe instead of being sarcastic or facetious here, Paul is just referencing how the Corinthians thought of those other apostles. Maybe it was even the Christians of the day in the first century that would think of those other apostles in this way. Turn in your Bibles just a couple pages over to Galatians chapter 2. In Galatians chapter 2, Paul describes some interaction that he had with those most eminent apostles. as he says in 2 Corinthians. And in Galatians chapter 2 and verse 9, he says, "In recognizing the grace that had been given to me, James and Cephas and John," and that's Cephas is Peter, so James and Peter and John, who were reputed to be pillars, he says, gave to me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, so that we might go to the Gentiles, and they to the circumcised. Paul admits that these are leaders in the church. They are reputed to be pillars in the church, and that's not a bad thing. That is a good thing. That is, we might say, a God thing. It is by God's design that the apostles would be these pillars in the church. And those apostles in Galatians chapter 2, Paul says they recognize Paul's role. And by the way, I was working on this lesson today. I shouldn't have stopped, but Paul's role is a very difficult two-word phrase to say. My tongue got so twisted up when I said that a few times. But those apostles recognized the role of Paul. I'll switch it up. They recognized that Paul was to deliver the gospel to the Gentiles. He was to go out into all the world. He was to leave Judea, just like we see Paul do through those missionary journeys. And those other apostles were to stay around Jerusalem. They were to deliver that gospel message to the Jews. They understood that they had two different roles, but they also understood what Paul is saying here is that neither role was inferior to the other. And I think what Paul is doing when he uses that phrase, most eminent apostles, is he's talking about maybe the authority and the respect that the church has for those men. And again, perhaps appropriately so. When I was a kid, we moved from California to just south of Nashville, Tennessee. And I grew up in California until the 8th grade. I never knew anything different, and there was quite a bit of culture shock in 1989 when we landed and started school just south of Nashville in Tennessee. It was a totally different world, and the world has gotten a lot smaller since the 1980s. But it was a totally different world. I remember as an 8th grader, being in my science class, and I think my science teacher's name was Mrs. Breeden, Carol Breeden. She actually went to church with us. And I didn't know that at the time, but she asked me a question in front of the class. And my answer was yes. And she stared me down with lasers coming out of her eyes and asked me the question again. And I said, yes. And she asked me the question a third time, and I said it slower and louder and more clearly, yes. And all she wanted to hear was the ma'am after the yes. I'd never said ma'am to anybody in my life. If I had said yes ma'am to my mother, I might have gotten slapped in the face for being disrespectful. I was from a different place. We didn't talk like that. We didn't speak like that. We went to church at a congregation in Nashville, Creve Hall, which is a very large congregation even today. I think they had about 1,500 members then, and I think they're bigger now. And in our 8th grade boys class, if I recall, there were about 30 boys in the Bible class. And you can imagine 30 8th grade boys, that's asking for trouble. And so from time to time, someone would start acting out, and they would get in trouble, and they would make them sit outside the classroom in the hallway right in front of the class. Now let me tell you, in California, if someone said, get out of the class and sit there, no one would stay in that seat. But these kids would sit in that chair, and they were scared to death because the elders walked around the halls during Bible class. And they were scared to death that one of the elders of the congregation was going to see them there, and they were going to be in big trouble. They respected those elders unlike anything that I knew growing up. We had respect for the elders, but my elders growing up were Frank and Ted and Gene. They had first names, but not at Creve Hall. I went home one time from a youth gathering, and my dad asked me how it went, and I said something about, well, Mr. Jackson told us this, and my dad laughed at me because I called him Mr. Jackson. We didn't talk like that. And so in different cultures, at different times, there are different ways that we might describe people with respect. We might show the authority that they have or describe that authority by the way that they speak of, the way that we speak of them, and I think that maybe that's simply what Paul is doing. In chapter 12 and verse 12 of 2 Corinthians, if we get back to our text, he continues his defense of not being inferior to anyone, and he says, the signs of a true apostle were performed among you with all perseverance, by signs and wonders and miracles. Paul is saying to the Corinthian church, I'm not inferior to anyone. You saw what took place when I was with you. The Corinthians, I think, are known well for their miraculous abilities. They've been given those among that church. But it seems the miraculous abilities of an apostle are something so far beyond that of just standard Joe Christian that if someone saw that, as the Corinthians did, they would know clearly this is an apostle of Christ. Paul says, you saw what took place when I was there. I'm not inferior to any other apostle. He's saying my authority should be respected just like you respect theirs. Second, as he stands before that jury, if you can imagine, he very plainly says, I am not a burden. And again, I think he's defending himself. I am not inferior to any other apostle, and I am not a burden. Look at verse 13. He says, for in what respect were you treated as inferior to the rest of the churches, except that I myself did not become a burden to you? Forgive me this wrong. And now again we see that sarcasm come out from Paul very clearly. Almost a, well, excuse me. I guess I should have burdened you. Paul is saying, because I did not charge you, because I never asked you, I didn't require you to support me financially, and we've seen that theme carry through both of these letters. Because I never took a penny from you, you think maybe that you've missed out on something great. Maybe my message is inferior to theirs. Maybe my authority is inferior to theirs because I didn't charge you. In verse 14, he says, here, for this third time, I am ready to come to you, and I will not be a burden to you, for I do not seek what is yours, but you. For children are not responsible to save up for their parents, but parents for their children. Paul says, I'm going to come to you again. And again, when I get there, I'm not going to burden you. I'm not going to take any of your money. I don't want your money. All that I want is you. Paul wants their faithfulness. He wants their love returned. He tells them, I treated you, and I'm going to continue to treat you like a parent would treat a child. Kids aren't supposed to save up for their parents' needs. Parents are supposed to save up for their children's needs. And I'm not talking about adult children taking care of their parents. There's something very noble and appropriate and even scriptural about that. But I'm talking about children. Paul says children don't save up for their parents. Parents take care of their children. When I was in college, I used to visit my grandparents a lot. And you've probably had grandparents like this or know people like this. You might be this person. But my grandfather loved to go out to eat. He loved to go to breakfast, like my friend Kenny Walker would go to breakfast every morning. He loved to go to breakfast and hang out with his friends and catch up on things, and he loved to take other people to a restaurant. Seems that when my grandparents turned about 75, they quit cooking altogether, and they loved to eat out every chance that they could, and if you visited them, you're bound to show up at some coffee shop or restaurant with them. They loved to take you to eat, but they would never, never, never let you pay. Regardless of what my financial circumstance was, and it was never impressive, regardless of what their financial circumstance was, no matter what it was, I don't know, I was never able to pay. My grandfather felt like it was his role as the grandfather to always pay. Now, I will say, if someone else happened along, he would pay for them too, and then he would complain all the way home about the fact that they allowed him to pay, but there was nothing you can do. But Paul says to these Corinthian Christians, I never took a dime from you. I'm still not going to take a dime from you. You are like children to me. And we've seen that before. 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 15, he says, I became your father through the gospel. Paul says, I gave you the gospel, and now I am here solely for your benefit, not the other way around. I don't need anything from you. I just want your faithfulness. I just want to help you grow in your faith. Think about it in our own lives. I don't need my children to lift me up. I don't need my children to tell me, Dad, you did a great job preaching that sermon this morning. Or I don't need my children to say, Dad, you did a great job mowing the yard. It looks good. Now, from time to time, they'll say something like that. And my heart swells up. And even though they may not understand exactly what they're saying or what they're doing, I love to hear them speak like that. But I don't need them to. But they need their father and mother to encourage them. They need their father and their mother, or one or the other, to give them guidance in their life. They are in need of positive feedback. They are in need of correction that we might give when it is needed. They need me and Julie to fill a role. We enjoy the positive from them, but we don't necessarily need it. And Paul says to these Christians, you are like children to me, and all that I'm concerned about is you. And if you pause right there and think for a moment about the sincerity of Paul, there is nothing more sincere than Paul as he writes to these Corinthian Christians. Think of all the problems that he has written about, all the accusations that have been made against him, all of the trouble that he has endured because of this congregation. All he wants to do is bring more souls to Christ. It's what we say all the time in our lives. It's what Paul is living in the text. He is incredibly sincere. He continues his defense, and he does that by making it clear that even after all that he's done, he would do it all over again. In verse 15, he says, I will most gladly spend and be expended for your souls. If I love you more, am I to be loved less? He says, I would spend and be expended. I would give everything that I have. And even more than that, I would give it the first time. I'd give every ounce that I have. I spend everything that I could possibly spend for your souls. And the New King James Version ends that verse. Though the more abundantly I love you, the less I am loved. Paul says, I am not inferior to any other apostle. I have never been a burden to you. And then Paul changes gears just a little bit as he closes, and he says, but I am afraid. And again, you imagine that jury hanging on his every word, listening to those statements. And then Paul closes, but I am afraid. Look at verse 20. He says, for I am afraid that perhaps when I come, I may find you to be not what I wish, and may be found by you to be not what you wish. That perhaps there will be strife and jealousy, angry tempers, disputes, slanders, gossip, arrogance, and disturbances. Paul says, I'm afraid that when I come, we aren't going to get along. I'm afraid that when I come, there are going to be clear divisions in the church. I'm afraid that when I come, you won't be what I hope that you'll be. And I'm afraid that when I come, I won't be what you hope I'll be. Maybe Paul is referencing what we studied in the last few weeks, that some have claimed that Paul is mighty in his writings, but in person, he's truly weak. Maybe Paul is saying, I'm afraid that you've listened to those men who said I'm weak in person. I'm afraid that you have disregarded the letters that I've written to you. I'm afraid that you've cast my instructions aside. I'm afraid that you haven't made any changes in your life because you don't believe that I'm going to back it up when I come. I'm afraid that when I get there, I'm going to be disappointed because you haven't made changes, and you're going to be disappointed because I'm not as weak as those false teachers claim that I am. Paul says, I'm afraid that when I come, there are going to be all sorts of problems in the church. I'm afraid that when I come, sin will have taken a foothold in the church, and maybe I will see the damage that sin has caused among the church. Paul says, I am worried about you. I am concerned about you. In verse 21, he says, I am afraid that when I come again, my God may humiliate me before you. And I may mourn over many of those who have sinned in the past and not repented of the impurity, immorality, and sensuality which they have practiced. Paul says, I am afraid that when I arrive, because some of you haven't repented of the sin in your life, the sin that Paul has so clearly talked about in these two letters, I'm afraid that because you have not repented of that sin, that you're still practicing that sin, that I am going to be humiliated, or maybe we could say embarrassed, before God. I'm afraid that when I get there, I'm going to mourn, Paul says, over many. Not just a couple in the church there. Paul is afraid that many will still be caught up in sin. That many in that congregation who have sinned, and it's known, will not have repented of those sins. Paul says, which they have practiced, meaning they're still living, walking, practicing those sins. Paul is worried that nothing in Corinth has changed, and we might note that repenting of sin means we change our practice. We stop practicing that sin. Paul says, I'm not inferior. He says, I am not a burden, but I am afraid. Have you ever thought about what a blessing a man like Paul was to the Corinthian church? Of all the problems that they struggled with, of all the problems that it might appear that Paul would cause by writing these letters. They wouldn't have the gospel without Paul, that's true. But the Corinthians have a man on their side in this sincere apostle who cares more about their souls than his own fame. He cares more about the souls of the Corinthian Christians than he cares about money. He cares more about their souls than he cares about any level of self-promotion or compliments that he might well deserve. He cares more about them and their eternal soul than he cares about his own itinerary or his own agenda, his own schedule. He cares more about their souls than he cares about anything else. Usually when we study passages like this, we might look at the example of Paul and his love for these Christians and the care that he has for them and the sincerity of Paul. And we might close the lesson and say we need to strive to be more like Paul. We need to care more about Christians around us. And we need to look around the room. We need to find someone who might be struggling in their faith, and we need to pay them more attention and help them overcome those things. We need to care more about spiritual matters, more than physical things of this world. Or maybe we would say we need to be more sincere in our faith. We need to be more like Paul. Maybe we should pray that someone like Paul would be part of our lives. Maybe we should put ourselves in the place of the Corinthians instead of the place of Paul. And recognize what a blessing Paul was to that congregation. Maybe we should be looking for someone like Paul who's willing to care for our souls in the way that Paul cared for theirs, like a parent should care for and take care of a child. Maybe we already have someone in our life like that who's willing to hold us accountable, who's willing to tell us when we stumble, who's willing to not let it go, but to address the problem when they see that problem. Maybe we just need to allow them to speak as boldly as Paul would speak about the sin that he recognized in those Christians. I know from personal experience, and I know you do too, that it's not easy to have someone correct you. It hurts to have someone point out my sin, and I imagine it hurts to have someone point out your sin, or to even let someone encourage you to do better. Sometimes that comes off as offensive when someone's trying to help you get better. But what a blessing having a person in our lives like Paul could really be.